act against President Vladimir Putin's regime. But that's not all. We've got team coverage on several breaking stories at this late hour. Jennifer Griffin reporting from the Pentagon on suspicious packages, some containing explosives, found at U.S. military bases tonight. Plus, Leland Vitter tracking the surging markets for the U.S. tonight, their best day since 2008, as moves on tariffs soothe out worries of an all-out trade war. But first, White House correspondent Kevin Corke with the latest on the Russia shakedown, where things are definitely heating up tonight. Good evening, Kevin.
Hey, good evening there, Shannon. You're right. Things are certainly heating up. Now, this is happening. Keep this in mind. The U.S. has said we would love to work with the Russians, okay? That's been the policy for quite some time. But that's if and when they cooperate. But they're destabilizing activities. Quite frankly, the White House officials tell us today they simply have to have consequences. And that was certainly apparent, not just here in the U.S., Shannon, but all over the globe today. At issue was that nerve agent attack. You know the one on a former Russian spy and his daughter. Well, it certainly garnered headlines all over the globe. And in fact, the unified reaction today by the world body has really been quite extraordinary. More than 100 Russian diplomats expelled from the U.S., the U.K., and more than a dozen other countries across the globe. Now, today, you may have heard this. I actually asked the White House if this attack on a key ally rose to the level of an attack, say, by proxy on the U.S. You mentioned that it was brazen and that it was reckless. Does an attack on the soil of a valued ally rise to the level of an act of war?
Well, we've been joined at the hip with UK on this matter, with the UK on this matter. We stand firmly with our ally. Again, I'll classify this action as both brazen and reckless, and I don't want to get ahead of anything the president may or may not announce.
As they say, the Russians are telling us that payback is on the way. You may have heard this also today, Shannon. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov telling us in a statement, this is something that we kind of expected. He said this: we deeply regret the taken decisions. We already stated and reconfirmed that Russia has never had any relation to this case. We will be guided, here's the key, by the principle of reciprocity as before. Now, the White House says that this may not be the only response to the nerve agent attack apparently perpetrated by the Russian government, but certainly that's something that we'll be keeping an eye on in the days and weeks ahead here, Shannon. The author of a very important book, though, we had a chance to have a conversation with Joel Rosenberg. You may have heard of this book. It's called The Kremlin Conspiracy. Well, tonight he is telling us the president really has to up the pressure on Russia.
This is a great move. It's the right move to kick out Russian diplomats, but it will not be enough to get Vladimir Putin's attention. President Trump has to do much more. He needs to toughen up economic sanctions, really hit Putin's money, the oligarchs' money, and he needs to start putting more deterrent forces in Europe close to Russia's border.
Very interesting conversation there with Joel Rosenberg. Meanwhile, tonight we also learned that incoming National Security Advisor John Bolton may be making sweeping changes over the NSC, the National Security Council. We are told that he is going to begin at the top. The idea, Shannon, is to stop the leaks. The NSC has been dogged by rumors of being the de facto leak factory inside the Trump administration, and so the thought is cleaning house may be the only way to ensure more message discipline. The president has already directed Mr. Bolton to do his part to clean things up there over at the NSC, and we are told he may begin at the top, but he won't likely stop there. Certainly that will be the case if need be. Shannon?
We stand by with bated breath.
Yes,
Kevin Corke from the White House, thank you so much. All right, multiple military bases in the Washington, D.C. area hit by suspicious packages tonight, days after a vehicle packed with propane tanks exploded at an airbase in Northern California. Jennifer Griffin has the latest from the Pentagon. Jennifer.
Shannon, a senior U.S. defense official, confirms multiple packages that contained explosive materials were sent to military installations in the D.C. area today. At about 8:30 this morning, a package addressed to the National Defense University arrived at Fort McNair. A few hours later, a package arrived at Fort Belvoir in Virginia. That package contained a fuse, but an Army explosive ordnance unit neutralized it. Fox News has learned exclusively that another suspicious package was sent to Dahlgren Naval Surface Warfare Center in southern Virginia, not far from Dam Neck in Virginia Beach, in close proximity to the largest fleet concentration area in the Navy. The story is developing as we speak. The packages are being examined at the FBI's lab in Quantico, Virginia. Just last week, an attack on an airbase near San Francisco was thwarted. A 51-year-old former Bay Area resident drove a flaming minivan loaded with propane tanks and gasoline cans through the main gate at Travis Air Force Base. He was later identified as Hafiz Kazi. Law enforcement officials described the incident as possible terrorism. Authorities extracted a video from the attacker's cell phone and are analyzing it to try and see if it could help point to a motive. Within the vehicle, investigators found 5 propane tanks, a gym bag with personal effects, 3 phones, 3 plastic 1-gallon gas cans, and several lighters. Now the FBI is investigating this spate of suspicious packages sent to U.S. military installations just a week after a serial bomber in Austin, Texas, blew himself up. Shannon?
Jennifer Griffin of the Pentagon, thank you very much. Well, the stock market surging today after its worst week in years, with reports the U.S. and China are open to negotiating trade policies, reducing fears of an all-out trade war. Leland Vittert's looking into it with what's happening tonight with President Trump's tariffs. Good evening, Leland.
Well, good evening, Shannon. We've talked about this political adage before. It's the economy, stupid. Friday, we saw the financial cost of a political decision. Today, the financial gain of softening the hard line on a trade war with China. This was the front page of the Wall Street Journal that traders woke up to. U.S.-China quietly seek trade solutions after days of loud threats. That story only cited people familiar, quote, with the situation, but it was clearly a planned leak to calm fears, laying out how the Trump administration might not be as tough with the Chinese as the president advertised. And it worked. The Dow had its single largest point gain since 2008, although it is far from the largest percentage gain. Traders who dumped stocks on Friday's fears of a trade war started buying them back like kids at a Toys R Us going out of business sale.
As far as the stock market, we were saying last week, we were overplaying this trade war thing. You know, this is Donald Trump being Donald Trump, and it looks like his aggressive nature, his crazy nature of bringing us to the brink of a trade war.
As if sensing the market's fear and the political implications of Friday's 700-point drop, this weekend, President Trump's Treasury Secretary and trusted advisor also tried to temper his boss's tough talk on Fox News Sunday.
As the president has said, we want to cut the trade deficit $100 billion over the next year. We want to eliminate forced joint ventures, forced technology, and we're having very productive conversations with them. I'm cautiously hopeful we reach an agreement, but if not, we are proceeding with these tariffs.
Let's put the market volatility in perspective for you. Between the trend of interest rate hikes and threats by the president, it's been a rough 6 weeks, well off from their all-time highs. But versus Election Day, the indices are way up. Dow up 32%, S&P 500 24%, NASDAQ up 39%. Now traders say there is too much emotion mixed with investors' fear of missing out on the next rally.
I see a lot of stuff that's worrisome. The first thing I would say is that this market is not trading on fundamentals. How can you have a 1,000-point swing? Did the value of all those companies just change that much in a day?
Stock traders are a little bit like lawyers. Ask 4, and you will get 5 opinions about what will happen tomorrow in the markets. The best indicator, of course, are the futures. Essentially, bet Shannon on tomorrow's open. Right now, they are up about 100 for Dow futures. Important to remember, Shannon, we would have to have another day like today to gain back what was lost just last week. The markets open in 10 hours and about 20 minutes.
We will be tuned in. Leland, thank you very much. Okay, so maybe things are smoothing over with China a bit on this trade war, but Russia now vowing to retaliate after the U.S. and European allies expelled dozens of Russian diplomats in what's said to be the largest collective expulsion in history. The move comes in response to the poisoning of a former Russian spy on British soil. A top Democrat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee appears to throw both praise and criticism at the administration today, saying this, quote, "The strong response to the attack in the UK makes even more bizarre the administration's weak response to Russia's ongoing attack right here in the United States." Let's talk about it with retired four-star general, chairman of the Institute for the Study of War and Fox News senior strategic analyst, General Jack Keane. Always good to see you, General.
Good to see you, Shannon.
Okay, so what do you make of this praise for the Trump administration that they're joining our allies and saying this absolutely cannot be permitted, this act on British soil? They believe is traced back to the Russians, while Democrats say, then why are you letting Putin mess with U.S. politics?
Well, I don't think we're letting Putin mess with U.S. politics. I mean, we've sanctioned him for that. To the case at hand here, in terms of throwing out the diplomats, listen, we have a history of having done this with the Soviet Union in the past. It has never, ever changed aggressive behavior. All that said, though, 20-plus countries coming together, all acting together, which was a use of WMD on foreign soil, trying to kill a British citizen and his daughter, and exposing other British citizens to this. Everyone takes that seriously. And what I'm hoping is it thickens the spine of these weak European leaders who have not been willing to stand up to Russian aggression in the past. In fact, the United States is involved, certainly, is commendable. And I also think Putin, what's happening to him, 18 years in power, 6 more, he just got as a result of the election. He really wants to be in power indefinitely like President Xi. And what normally happens with these dictators, the longer they stay in power, the more aggressive they get, the more ambitious they get, the more violent they get, and the more paranoid they get. And I believe all of that's happening to Putin. And I also think what's happening to him, he's coming to the realization that we do have a different president here than what we've had in the past. Because what the president has done against the Syrians in the chemical attack, Russia's client state, lethal aid to the Ukrainians, putting more troops into Europe, sanctioning the Russians as a result of meddling in the elections, and now this. There's a pattern there that the president is moving, not just dealing with a competitor like Russia, but wanting to confront Russia. He would also like the Russians to cooperate with us. But we're not going to get that in the near term.
Well, and I point to this tweet by the Russian embassy here in the U.S. today, getting a little cheeky with this whole thing, saying U.S. administration ordered the closure of the Russian consulate in Seattle. What U.S. consulate general would you close in Russia if it was up to you to decide? And then they have a poll there, a Twitter poll, saying which one should we close down? I mean, they've said today we will retaliate. Does it go beyond them kicking out some of our diplomats now?
Yeah, it's pretty much the same thing that happens every time. The reciprocation will be like number of diplomats and spies, and obviously we have spies in Russia that are undercover working out of our embassies, and also a consulate or two they'll shut down, or some other facility that we're using that may not be a consulate. There'll be reciprocation, but it will not deter Putin from the path he's on. Listen, he's made a move into the Middle East. He's trying to be the most influential nation in the Middle East, replacing the United States. This aggression is obvious. He's aligned himself with the Iranians. And it's only going to be when we're actually willing to put force in front of him and let him see some of that, like more troops into Europe and standing up even more so for the Ukrainians. And then finally, financially, going after Putin and the cronies around him. That starts to get at him. And also impact them economically, particularly with liquid natural gas. I mean, the Europeans depend on Russia. Let's replace that dependence with the capability we've got. And then you start hitting him in his pocketbook. He's got a one commodity economy. It's oil and gas. And we reduce that, he'll have some problems.
Yeah, pain for him and the oligarchs would probably translate into a different response. We'll see. General, always great to have your expertise with us. Thanks for coming in. All right, Russia maneuvering in the Middle East is coming at a cost for the Kremlin, one that may actually have major consequences for President Vladimir Putin and his regime. Amy Kellogg reports for us tonight from Moscow. Amy.
Some polls show Russians think their mission in Syria has been one of their biggest national accomplishments. With ISIS largely defeated as a territorial force there, it's job done, and officially, Russia has pulled out. But it hasn't.
We're not planning to get out ever.
Russia has key Mediterranean military bases in Syria.
While we keep the bases, we're going to have military presence in Syria. Absolutely. And actually, Israel says it's okay, too. The Israeli officials have said that they welcome the Russian presence. Russia is a friend. And them being in Syria is just good. As long as that can help Israel control the Iranians.
Russia's entry into Syria has angered Western nations, but also made it some friends in the region. Not many countries can boast being in good stead with Iran, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. Moscow can these days, but Russia may now be in too deep.
It is a challenge for Moscow now to balance the amount of resources it has and amount of resources it wants to commit to the region with the scope of its ambition. And, you know, if it doesn't do this particularly good job on this one, then it may risk the fate of the USSR, who kind of, was outstretched in itself.
So far, Putin has contained official Russian military losses because of the reportedly widespread use of mercenaries.
He remembered pretty well bad Afghan experience. That's why he wants to use not regular troops for whom he is responsible, but these proxies.
Alexander Goltz says Russians would have pity for conscripts killed in action, but less for hired guns.
But if you are mercenary, for God's sake, you choose this life.
But according to many, the relationship between the Russian Ministry of Defense and the so-called Wagner mercenaries soured after it was exposed. Finally, Putin's relationship with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad appears to have become complicated. Assad has reportedly coerced Putin into fighting a lot of non-ISIS rebels, something the Kremlin never signed up for.
So we think Putin is a hostage to Bashar al-Assad and Iran's plans to clear up the entire territory of Syria.
Experts say that Putin should have laid out the terms of his support for the Assad regime before he went in the first place. Now, perhaps, it is too late. And finally, with ISIS having faded to a large extent as a common enemy, the U.S. and Russia are increasingly likely to clash on the Syrian battleground. Shannon.
Amy Kellogg, thank you so much from Moscow. Just ahead, former President Obama has a vision for our next generation of leaders. They should all be just like him. And it took almost 50 years to get it made, but tonight we discussed the soon-to-be-released movie about the Kennedys' darkest chapter. And the Avengers franchise has been box office gold, but I've got a story about Marvel heroes with hearts of gold. Unbelievable. Stay tuned.
Those of us that are in states that Trump won, we would really appreciate if she would be more careful and show respect to every American voter and not just the ones who voted for her.
Chris Arwalt, Fox News politics editor and author of the Halftime Report. Good to see you tonight, sir.
Woof.
Not surprising that Senator McCaskill is in a very tough race.
Yep.
This stuff does not help her. I believe Marie Harford that said last week, like, could Hillary Clinton just go away? No offense, but just she's not helping current Democrats.
Well, and the question is, what is she doing it for? I don't understand. She's rich. She's richer than Croesus. She and her husband have fully exploited every nickel's worth of value in their public careers. They and their great-grandchildren should be set.
Do you think it's a more personal thing with her, though? She wants to fight back against why she lost, who she thinks caused her to lose, how it happened. I mean, the book is what happened.
In the larger sense, the problem for the Clintons is that history is getting them. They're getting ground up. Her husband is now basically has been unpersoned essentially by Democrats. Once upon, he was the great explainer, and he was going to help Democrats in red states, and he was going to do all that stuff. They can't really be seen with him in public anymore, given the new way in which we are looking at his conduct in the 1990s and before. So he's got that. Her legacy is ruined because she lost twice. She lost to two of the most improbable individuals. She lost to Barack Hussein Obama in 2008, and she lost to Donald J. Trump in 2016. It's not going to come together for her. And I understand the pain at the end of a long and storied public life, that you don't want your political epitaph to be, she was the one who blew it. But that's life.
All right, now someone that the Democrats are happy to have out there campaigning for them, in most cases, depends on the district, is former President Barack Obama. Yeah. Here is what he said about how the world can be fixed.
If I could do that effectively, then, I would create 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 young Barack Obamas or Michelle Obamas, or, the next group of people who could take that baton in that relay race that is human progress.
That is human progress.
Well, now, I mean, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt on this. In context, it's not perfect. Obviously, he has always has had some I, me, mine problems in his public utterances, much like the current occupant of the Oval Office. It takes a lot of ego. Takes a lot of ego to want to run for president.
To want to even run.
To want to run and put yourself through that meat grinder, it takes a lot. I think in this case, what he's trying to say is he and his wife have a hagiographic version of their growing up where they shunned big money to be in public service, and they shunned opportunities so that they could do these things. And I think he's talking about that version of themselves.
Okay, very quickly, I want to ask you about this new Fox News poll that shows a tightening on the generic ballot when we ask about Democrats and Republicans. It was about a 15-point spread back in October of last year. It's now down to 5 points. We got a long way to go, but is that good news for the GOP?
Well, it's definitely good news for Republicans, and it's also in keeping with what else we've seen from other good public pollsters. No one's as good as ours, of course, but what we've seen from other good public pollsters essentially is that the Republicans brought the tax cuts after their success with tax cuts, the Republicans got it back into a more reasonable playing field. If the election were held today, I'm doubtful about their abilities to hold the House, but you know what this tells them? This tells them that their actions have consequences.
Yeah, they do, and it translates into hard data.
Yeah.
So, all right, you're good at translating the hard data.
That's what I'm here for.
Okay, Chris Darwell, good to see you.
You bet.
Our tensions remain high in Sacramento tonight with families.
In last week's marches that blocked traffic and prevented fans from getting into the Sacramento Kings game. The Kings have since worn pregame T-shirts with Stephon Clark's name on the back and the phrase, "Accountability, we are one," on the front. On March 18th, after a 911 caller reported a suspect vandalizing cars and homes, deputies in a sheriff's helicopter with night scope video alerted 2 Sacramento police officers on the ground that the suspect was carrying a tire iron. When the officers located Stephon Clark, they apparently mistook a cell phone for a gun and fired 20 shots. Clark had made his way back into his grandparents' backyard when he was killed. Now the California NAACP and others are demanding criminal charges against the officers involved. The NAACP is also asking the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division to investigate the shooting. Famed civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump is representing the Clark family. Watch.
We will not let Stephon's death be non-existent, nor will we let his life be non-existent. We will hold him up. We will hold this family up. We will stand up for Stephon. We will speak up for Stephon. And we will fight for Stephon until we get justice for Stephon.
The police officers involved have not been named, and the California Peace Officers Bill of Rights means the officers' personal records, including promotions, disciplinary actions, and annual reviews, are confidential. The Sacramento Bee editorial board is now calling on the state's Democratic lawmakers to change the law and allow for more transparency. Though in Ferguson, Missouri, after the shooting of Michael Brown, that type of transparency led to then Democratic Governor Jay Nixon and others to call for a rigorous prosecution of Officer Darren Wilson even before the investigation was complete. Officer Wilson was exonerated by a court of law and by Eric Holder's Justice Department, but Wilson lost his job, got numerous death threats, and still lives in relative isolation. Shannon.
Trace, thank you very much. No fake news here. It is time for the Real News Roundup. Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington Post reporter Robin Givhan attending a black entertainment television event starring former First Lady Michelle Obama. Givhan made the mistake of reporting on Mrs. Obama's comments. BET told participants it was an intimate affair with the former First Lady, which apparently should have been interpreted as off the record. Givhan was then asked to leave the event, and a panel discussion she was supposed to host was canceled. New York Democratic Governor Andrew Cuomo making fun of the rhythm of Jews at a predominantly black church in Harlem. He said Catholics like him are not as without rhythm as some of our Jewish brothers and sisters. That comes as the Democratic governor does a die-in with gun control activists. He is facing what's being called tonight by the New York Post the political fight of his life against actress Cynthia Nixon, who called Cuomo Andrew the Bully in her first news conference.
The people of New York are sick of being bullied. He's cleaned up Albany about as well as Donald Trump has drained the swamp.
She's also accusing the governor of being in the old boys club, ruling New York politics. While Hollywood's getting rare praise from conservatives for the upcoming movie Chappaquiddick, we'll examine the film that is shining a new, unfavorable light on the early days of the Lion of the Senate. And a little bit later, we will pay tribute to the French police officer who made the ultimate sacrifice in the line of duty last week. Is from conservatives for its effort to tell the untold story of Chappaquiddick, a story some argue that the Kennedy family has sought to silence until now. On July 18, 1969, the late Senator Ted Kennedy was involved in a car accident on Martha's Vineyard that ended up killing 28-year-old passenger Mary Jo Kopechne. The infamous Chappaquiddick incident, named for the rural, remote southeast corner of the island where the crash occurred, happened when Kennedy drove his Oldsmobile off a narrow wooden bridge into a small creek after a day of partying. Although accounts of what actually happened that night conflict, it seems Kennedy alerted his friends about the accident, but failed to tell police until the next morning, far too late to save Kopechne, whose family members have spoken out over the years.
I believe there was damn little truth in what he told them. He told them what they wanted to hear, or what he needed to tell them to cover his ass.
Kennedy ultimately pleaded guilty to leaving the scene of an accident and got a suspended sentence. Kennedy passed away without clarifying the many unanswered questions, and his loyalists all but remained silent about the incident. And for the most part, Hollywood steered clear of the story.
They were always a Hollywood-type family, and so Hollywood always played along with them.
Until now.
It's a fair movie. It's balanced. But
Mark Chardy is the executive producer of Chappaquiddick in theaters on April 6th.
But it, certainly takes, Ted to task for this.
This country has a deep connection to the Kennedy name, and that is a valuable thing, gentlemen.
Chappaquiddick tells the Kopechne-Kennedy story over the course of 1 week, when there was another major moment in American history.
That's one small step for man.
JFK's greatest achievement and Ted's biggest failing, all happened in that week, and it probably helped, get cover for the story.
I had 3 generations of advisors up my ass trying to convince me to run.
Nevertheless, Kennedy's presidential aspirations were dashed after Kopechne's death. But the Lion of the Senate ultimately served nearly 47 years in the upper house. And even today, some Hollywood A-listers reportedly would not take the leading role, ultimately played by Australian Jason Clarke. So why would Hollywood tackle the aura of Camelot after all this time? Let's bring in Fox News contributor and former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee. Governor, what do you make of this getting made? I mean, a lot of folks have said even if you tried to make this 10, 15 years ago, it wouldn't have happened. So why now?
I think a lot of it is that America now realizes that 50 years ago, there was an incredible tragedy in which someone got treated differently because of their last name, because of the wealth, the power, the influence, and the fact the media wanted to cover for the Kennedy family. I don't know that that would happen today, but there are still those moments in which people do get different treatment than somebody who doesn't have the last name, or all of the wealth, or the power, or the media cover. And it's really one of the reasons that a lot of Americans are just utterly frustrated with the institutions of power, because they don't believe that they play the same way for people of power as they do for just an ordinary person. Here's a simple question. What would have been the case had Mary Jo Kopechne been driving the car and Ted Kennedy was the one who suffocated in a pocket of air and suffered for hours? Because that's what happened. She didn't just drown. She was in a pocket of air, they later realized under the autopsy, and it was hours, and it was 10 hours later before Ted Kennedy ever told the police what happened. It's just a horrible tragedy. Reverse the role and ask yourself, do you think that they would have said to Mary Jo Kopechne, we're going to give you a probated sentence?
Right. Well, here is what the producer of the film says. We talked with him, Mark Chardy. Here's what he said about how he thinks this would play out today.
Had something like this happened, it would be a frenzy. I don't think he'd be off, the front page or the news cycle for more than, 5 minutes. So I think the pressure would have been different.
So why do you think it was different then? Do you think that the media was more protective of public figures, whether they would have been Republicans or Democrats? What's changed in the interim?
Well, there was certainly a protection about the Kennedys. I mean, there was so many widespread stories about President Kennedy's affairs, not years before he was president, but while he was president in the White House. So those kind of stories just got covered up. People didn't know about the fact that he had Addison's disease. That would have been a huge news story if it were happening today. So we're living in a different culture. 24-hour cable news is a part of it, but it's a different time. There's no question about it.
Well, conservative radio host Howie Carr, he also wrote a piece for the Boston Herald, I believe, in his review where he talked about the fact that a lot has changed in the interim. This is what he says about how the Kennedys have been treated over the years.
You might say that the myth that was concocted around the Kennedys from the time of World War II on to almost the present time was the first example of fake news. It was just total mythology.
I mean, Governor, he claims there were other producers who tried to tell the story over the years and they never worked in Hollywood again. That's his claim.
I think he's right. I think the fact that a lot of Hollywood A-listers turned down this movie is indicative that there is still a bias. Nobody wants to say something really negative about Democratic icons, but you don't have any problems getting actors to want to play in roles that would be very, very, let's say, derisive of Richard Nixon or of other Republican figures.
All right, I wonder who's going to play President Trump. Because you know the movies are coming. Governor, thank you for weighing in from Florida. Good to see you.
Thank you.
All right, now Stormy is at the center of the firestorm. Did her big interview backfire? More on that straight ahead.
In the modern world, it pays to switch.
This client never did reveal during her 60 Minutes interview last night.
All of that went out.
You said to me, that's a question that Ms. Daniels will have to ultimately answer. Cut to last night, she's asked directly about this on 60 Minutes, and she says, my attorney has instructed me not to answer. So, does she or doesn't she have this evidence?
Again, we're not going to get into the details of everything we have at this time, and there's a reason for that. We're not going to play our hand right now, and the reason is because we have a case to win.
I asked him the same question. You saw it here on Fox News at night last week. All right, tonight's panel. Al Motter, a Democratic strategist. Charlie Hurt, Washington Times opinion editor and Fox News contributor. And Derek Hunter, contributing editor for the Daily Caller. Welcome all.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, Al, what do you make of the talk today that Avenatti may actually be in trouble himself for, first of all, filing this lawsuit not under seal, so everything was exposed, and potentially if there are recordings of President Trump, that could violate California laws as well?
Well, the beauty is that truth will come out, right? The court of law will determine whether or not he's right, whether Michael Cohen or his lawyers are right. I noted that today, Avenatti filed another suit against Cohen for defamation. So we had a lot of dual legal things going on here, and it's not clear who's right.
Yeah, in state court and federal court. This is what Robert Barnes wrote on Law and Crime. He said he chose to file the suit that disclosed confidential information publicly rather than under seal in his suit to set aside the non-disclosure confidentiality agreement. By doing so, Avenatti exposed his client to a $20 million judgment. Charlie?
I don't know how you get around the fact that they clearly are violating the non-disclosure agreement, and you may not like non-disclosure agreements, but they're very routine. They happen all the time. And so it's very strange. But the other question that has bugged me since the beginning about this is, whose financial situation changes so dramatically in such a short period of time that you're willing to cash that check for $130,000 to not say anything, to suddenly be willing to pay the $130,000 back so you can tell your story, and even possibly further be exposed to a $20 million judgment? What else? Is there something else going on here? Is there other money that we don't know about? Well, it's very curious to me.
Yeah, and I asked him
a lot with women in the Me Too movement where they come out later and say, I'm not going to say something, then I am going to say something.
Well,
so.
And I mean, I asked him last week, Derek, who is funding this? And he kind of hemmed and hawed a little bit and said there's like a crowdsourcing thing, but it's on GoFundMe, but you won't find it there. I mean,
that crowd in Davos? I mean,
I don't know.
Where are they? It is a really bizarre thing. You got the money, you got what you wanted, you agreed to these terms, and then suddenly, for no reason whatsoever, after denying it 3 times publicly, say, yeah, well, now you can have your money back. The $130,000 to most people is a lot of money. She must think that there's a pot of gold at the end of this rainbow. But I will say about this interview, it was the biggest letdown I've ever seen since Al Capone's vaults. It was, the lawyer was such a fixture on cable news that he'd given away the store and all the secrets that you watched, and you said, well, this is just a reiteration, but from her for the first time, of everything that she said. So I'm not really sure what value there is in that story. So I think Charlie's right that there's got to be somebody writing a check and adding a zero the longer this drags out each time, because I see no strategic advantage to this. I see no win, and I don't see particularly good lawyering from a guy who is the one who violated the non-disclosure agreement on behalf of his client. It not only puts her in jeopardy, it puts him in jeopardy in California with the bar.
With all these dueling lawsuits, it is going to take time for this all to, we'll be watching it. It will last the length of President Trump's presidency, whether that's 4 or 8 years, is going to continue. Okay, I want to quickly make sure we get you all to weigh in on Rick Grenell. Our audience very familiar with him. He's been nominated for months now to be the ambassador to Germany. He would be the first openly gay Republican ambassador, my understanding out there. And Democrats continue, Al, to block him and make it impossible for him to move forward. Well, we have German politicians now complaining, we want a U.S. ambassador.
Well, not all Democrats. Senator Chris Coons and others are saying we need to move forward on these ambassadorial nominations. And I think it's really a pox on both parties' houses, truthfully. Both parties are to blame for nominations not going through. It's Mitch McConnell, after all, who blocked Merrick Garland for over a year. And frankly, both are to blame, and both should fix the problem. I worked in the Senate at a time, as did Carter, when senators didn't campaign against each other, didn't raise money against each other. And if a colleague had a nominee, they would vote for their colleague's nominee. We've lost that collegiality.
I can't imagine that.
Well, I wish Mitch McConnell would lead like he's the leader of the majority in the United States Senate. The rules are in place, 30 hours, 1 hour per senator who can speak up to 2 times, but only for a total of 1 hour. Senate can be open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If the Democrats want to play this dragging the feet game, he says, okay, we're not going home anymore. It's nonstop. Every 30 hours, we're going to vote on these things unless and until you agree to change the standing rules of the Senate to go from 30 hours to 8 just for this Congress. They did it in 2014. They can do it again. But Mitch McConnell wants to work 3 days a week from 9 to 5, go make his dinners and do whatever else he does rather than lead the majority in the Senate.
Quickly, Charlie, both sides to blame?
To some degree, but certainly I think Democrats have sort of invented a lot of this stuff, especially with judicial nominations, as you know. But I have a hard time listening to Democrats complain about Trump not being as active in the world as he should be while they're holding up these nominations.
All right, we'll watch this because everybody's got an eye on this Grenell nomination, among others. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Free Rick.
With you.
Yeah, free Rick. Okay, we told you last week about the ISIS-inspired terrorist who went on a rampage, killing 3 after taking hostages at a French supermarket. Well, we've learned that that police officer who traded places willingly with one of the hostages during the standoff made the ultimate sacrifice. Colonel Arnaud Beltrame was shot in the neck. He died over the weekend, and tonight well-wishers are leaving notes and flowers at a memorial for the colonel at France's National Police Headquarters. He is a true national hero. We're going to tell you about some more heroes in just a minute. Some of the biggest names in Hollywood answering a call for a sick child. We're going to warm your heart with a wonderful response I got from a single tweet that went viral over the weekend.